Well, it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Matthias Neumann, who's an artist and architect based in New York City and in Athens, Greece. His work has been included in exhibitions at Manifesta 8, the National Museum of Contemporary Art Romania, and Arte Laguna at the Venice Arsenale, among many others. An exhibition focusing on a project executed in 2021 while on residency with Enclave Land Art in Alicante, Spain, is currently on view with my gallery, Bianca Bova Gallery, here in Chicago. Neumann has also had a significant number of public art installations throughout the US as part of his Basics series. That includes Basics number 51, which is now on view in Milwaukee as part of Sculpture Milwaukee's 2021 exhibition. There is This We, which is curated jointly by Theaster and Michelle Grabner. He's also the recipient of the Kaplan Directors Award at the Cape Cod Art Museum and has been a fellow with MacDowell Colony, the Lower Austrian Architecture Network, iPark, and the Vermont Studio Center. He also teaches at the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College, New York. And we are very pleased to have him here as a guest lecturer in our series. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Matthias.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you, Brian. And thank you, Sculpture Milwaukee, for inviting me in the first place to speak about my recent work, and for inviting me, obviously, for the exhibition currently on view. I've always felt a bit reluctant to speak about my work, as in the end, everyone sees in the work anyway what they want to see, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I'm not that interested in to be my own interpreter, but that said, I do recognize that all we do in our actions, and certainly in our artistic output, can be understood as an attempt to communication with oneself, with the like-minded, with God, and with the random stranger alike. And with that in mind, I believe it might not be such a bad exercise after all to add some thoughts and context to my current installation at Sculpture Milwaukee. I hope you take this remark already as an open invitation to the Q&A, which will follow after the presentation, to actually engage in dialogue with myself and with everybody else. Basics number 51, which is currently on exhibit at There Is This We, is part of an ongoing work series under the title Basics that I've been working on for the past 7 years with installations all over the country, with one exception, all of them in the US. The number 51 refers to the chronological sequence, which means there are now more than 50 pieces in existence. In fact, there are 54 at this point. The last was just installed in Orlando, Florida. All pieces are distinct in form and size and in how they interact with their respective sites, but they all share a material language, which comes from the use of 2x4 construction lumber, and they share an attitude in that they are all temporary installations in the public realm. And it's this constituting quality of the work series Basics as temporary public art that I want to expand on a little bit in this talk. And there are really 3 distinct aspects to unpack here. The temporality of the installations, the public aspect of the work, and the conception of the construction of these pieces as a work of art. The later aspect, I only want to mention in passing, as I personally have a deep-seated distrust in artists being their own critics and cultural apologists. I recently moved to Athens, which is where I'm talking from right now. And I learned that the word for artist in Greek is kaliteknis, which literally translated means into English, a good technician. A translation I really quite like in terms of thinking about the work I'm doing. That means someone who does things well and beautiful, and I might also add meaningful, meaning thoughtful. Basics is based on a developed language that explores a formal sculptural language that is inherent in this most ubiquitous material use and in the construction process. the 2x4 lumber. Like all pieces within the series are constructed out of 2x4 lumbers, and all of them are untreated. Basically the most basic material you can think of. There's a material and formal contingency in this work that reaches through various aspects of sculpture through the past century, and which I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A after this talk. But for now, I would like to leave it in claiming that these objects are well-made objects in the public realm, whose beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, which would be you in this case. The work series Basics is quite deliberately conceived to be situated in the public realm. Educated as an architect, a continued interest of mine is how material interventions in space interact with our perception, including all senses, except maybe taste, and our individual and social actions within that space. Public space is where different actions and desires are being negotiated, and where agency between object and subject is in continuous flux. There's an element of indeterminacy as soon as the art object leaves the controlled confines of the studio, the gallery, or the museum. It means, in part, to give up artistic agency over the work to the degree that agency is given to the audience, the public, to interact with the work however they choose, not how the artist necessarily intends. This concept is quite central to the work, and I like to think of it as an exploration of sculpture as an extension of public space. Most installations in this series have, in one way or another, a spatial element to them, and in conjunction with the rather cheap and familiar material quality of the 2x4s, the work creates a certain indeterminate quality for the audience, where it's not quite clear if the work is only to be interacted with visually, like you typically understand sculpture, or if you may touch it, climb on it, or sit in it, etc. To be clear, it is important to me and quite critical to me that each installation does have a formal presence that can be appreciated in a sculptural context. But it is equally interesting to me to somewhat blur the line of agency between the viewer and the artist. Because what else is or should be public space but a negotiated dialogue of action and space between a multitude of strangers we call public? Since my work is spread all over the country, and unfortunately I do lack the resources to properly document the work over time to see how the work is actually used, I have only anecdotal evidence on how this public aspect of the work actually unfolds and plays out. But I found Instagram to be a somewhat random but good resource. It takes a little research and a little searching, but it's a resource where you can actually get an idea of how people do interact with the work and to validate this aspect of the work series. To be clear, sorry, I have to switch off my phone here. To be clear, all these Instagram photos are found, basically. Yeah, it takes a little hashtag search. But how people actually interact with the work can be found that way, quite to my satisfaction. All installations of Basics are conceived to be temporary and are constructed out of untreated 2x4 wood studs. The temporality of the work has practical, institutional, as well as logistical reasons, but also expresses an attitude towards the material realm that is quite critical to how I perceive my own actions in time. What is temporary sculpture after all? Permanence is a rather relative construct as far as I'm concerned, since all material and living expressions are embedded in cycles of permanent change. The perception of change and permanence is really only an expression of the time scale that we attach to a particular perception of a particular process. And I'm quite content to have the work reflect cycles of change that are in tune with my own lived experience, and which also hold to be irrelevant for engaging in the public sphere, I think. The installations within the work series have a lifespan somewhere between 6 months and 4 years. Most of them are about 1 year or 2 years, with one exception, which you see here, which is an installation I realized early on in 2015 for IPARC Foundation in Connecticut, and which is allowed to slowly disintegrate back into the forest for as long as it takes. The aspect of change over time acts on the work not only in regards to a limited time span of the installation, but also in regards to the actual material change over time of the work while it is installed, while it is seen. And in regards of use and reuse of the elements that make up the work as part of a larger material cycle. The installations are realized with untreated wood, as I said before, and while great care is taken that the work is structurally safe and stable for the time of installation, the wood itself does significantly and visibly age over the time span of the installation. The degree to which each work changes over time is largely depending on the local conditions, the type of wood used, and of course, the duration of the installation. But it's safe to say that pretty much in all cases, the sculpture has a different expression at the end of its lifespan than it did at the time of installation. In this, the work itself marks time and becomes over time more part of the environment. As it is with common change, this may not be perceived consciously by people who use the spaces every day. But I'm certain that there's an element of that slowly recedes into one could call like the subconsciousness of the material every day that acts upon the perception of the work. And I'm quite fond of that. This particular work you see here, which was installed in New Canaan, Connecticut, on the left-hand side was right after installation. On the right-hand side was in the middle of the summer, like late summer. And the piece was already conceived with the knowledge that the grass grows really high there. So even within that natural cycle of, it was only installed for 9 months, that natural cycle, the sculpture actually has a marking of time that interacts with the landscape. Another aspect of the temporal existence of the work is that the whole process of the work is out in the open. Every installation begins for me with a visit to the local lumber yard or Home Depot, where the material is purchased and driven to the site. The construction and installation takes place on site, usually in a day or two, and there is a performative element in the process that binds the work to the material and social process of the site. Most installations are realized entirely by myself. Some are realized with local assistance and help, as the installation here in Milwaukee was realized in collaboration with 2 students from the architecture school of the University of Wisconsin, Sean Griffith and Kelly Detman, that you can see here in those Instagram images. But in any event, the installation itself becomes a performative act that opens itself up to the unsuspecting public and passerby, all the way from installation to the slow aging process on site to the installation and the eventual reuse of the wood in some other mundane construction project. I like to think of these installations as a temporary formal expression of material in transition, acted out in the public realm. And this brings me to a more recent project where the notion of process and material transitioning from one site-responsive sculptural expression to another was condensed into a durational and performative act. Last November, I was invited by Enclave Land Art, which is a non-for-profit entity located in Spain, to participate in their annual residency in a beautiful valley in southern Spain, the Val de Gallinera. The project encompassed an intense engagement with the landscape over a period of 2 weeks under the title Camino Fantasma, translated Ghost Walk. While the project is not nominally part of the ongoing work series Basics, it's closely related and a somewhat condensed performative action of what the sculpture series is about. One could say it's Basics on steroids, maybe. The Camino Fantasma was realized using 100 pieces of wood, the cheapest wood there is, pallet wood, kind of one could call it the blue collar type of wood. These 100 pieces migrated over the course of 2 weeks along a picturesque mountain path, about 1.5 miles long, linking the two villages of La Carroja and Benyali in the Val de Gallinera in Alicante. And in the process of this procession, I might call it, the wood morphed from one sculptural form to another sculptural form to another sculptural form to yet another. Altogether 4 sculptural installations. The process was such that each of the 4 installations, except for the very last one, was only in existence for 1 day, each taking up 3 days of the ongoing work process. 1 day to install the work, 1 day the work was in existence, and 1 day to deinstall the work and to move the wood to the next location. The last installation, Fantasma number 4, is to remain in place for an unspecified amount of time and will be allowed to recede back into the forest. But it's important to consider that this last installation is not a discrete sculpture, but a remnant of a process, a temporary manifestation of material in transition, and that there were 3 distinct sculptural forms as part of this material history. I like to think of the structures as ghosts, as they have left their material form and have moved on into another form. Ghosts exist as long as the spirit of the expression still captures our imagination. A ghost ceases to exist when the imagination does not engage with the spirit anymore. And that will mark the lifespan of this particular work. The 4 iterations along this procession through the valley are, however, not intended to be solipsistic formal mutations along the road either, but each installation intends to partake in a specific moment of the surrounding landscape, to be specific to the topography. As such, the project tries to engage with the notion of land art that is specific to its environment, as a temporary ghostly imprint, as a momentary dialogue with the topography and topology that opens up as one moves along the path. Fantasma number 1 is located in the crevice where the steep path turns upon itself 180 degrees. The sculpture forces the upward perspective and follows the steep topography carved into the landscape. Fantasma number 2 is located in very close proximity to the Corral de la Carroja, an old and landmarked stone enclosure that was used in former times as a remote animal shelter for whatever was herded to grass the mountainside. The path squeezes past the old stone wall, and a series of passages constitute the experience of the site. Fantasma number 3 engages a long downward slope and appears and reappears as one moves along the path. The installation extends for about 100 meters, and there's no single point from where the entire installation can be viewed as a whole. And the work becomes part of one's movement down the valley slope. And Camino number 4 is wrapped around an existing tree in the valley at the end of the path, and installation intends to bring the material back to its imaginary source. There are these 2 images that I have taken while working in the Val de Gallinera that are conceptually quite important or that somehow illustrate the intent of this work quite well. As they're illustrating this appreciation of material and transition, like that there is a life side, material is not anything that is static on the one hand, and on the other hand, it might even be so ephemeral that it just imprints a ghost, as on the right-hand side, a ghost image of a tree, which will vanish. However, once you've seen it, at least once I have seen it, it will stay in my mind and it will retain that ghostly presence for longer than it actually exists. And with that, I hope you will have gained a new perspective the next time you pass by 200 Milwaukee Avenue, where you can still see Basics number 51 through fall this year. And with that, I'm also at the end of my short little presentation and would rather want to have some time to have a dialogue and engage with questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, for your presentation. I think that gives everyone a really broad and really clear picture of the depth and breadth of your practice and where the work that's currently in Milwaukee fits into that. And I wanted to start out by kind of looking back at a couple of things that you've mentioned throughout the presentation to frame this a little bit further. And the first is looking at Camino Fantasma and this idea of the ghost, or what it means to have materials in transition. And looking at the basic series and having seen you construct them or seen documentation of them being constructed, there's a great deal of repetition involved, sometimes quite literally in the design, certainly in the act of construction. And when I was looking at footage of Camino Fantasma, which you can see if you're interested in seeing kind of that development process, there's a video on my gallery's website in which you can find through Enclave Land Art that illustrates a little bit more of that and goes a little more in depth. But watching these kind of processions of the materials traveling from one site to the next, and if some of this repetition and the act of procession and the act of movement almost becomes like ritual, and what influence or role ritual plays in your practice, especially knowing that there is this kind of spiritual quality to it.
That's an excellent question.
I've had time to think about your work.
Yeah, good. Typically, I'm inclined to me, this series of works has many aspects that can be unpacked, and I can kind of like unpack a few aspects in that. The ritual aspects of it. I was talking to a friend of mine, fellow artist here in Athens the other day, and he was asking me about the artist talk that I'm going to give. And I used him a little bit as a sounding board. And his reply was, well, and he didn't know the project that I had done in Spain. And he said, like, well, to me it sounds like this whole work is about labor, right? It's an illustration of labor, which it is to a degree, but I'm not that interested. I personally think this is really just, this is an aspect that plays into the material in transition, or that plays into the various formal expressions along the way. I'm within the work. I mean, there's repetition, there's formal repetition just through adding these 2x4s. There's a repetitive constructive process. There's also, like within Camino Fantasma, there is kind of like a very structured process of, like, allowing 3 days, like installation, existence, deinstallation, and repeat. That is quite rigorous. But to me, these are really, to be honest, they're more helpful structures to illustrate what the project is about. And to me, the ritual in of itself, the ritual is kind of like it's a helping mechanism, but not something that to me is very important, kind of like as a content in of itself. Which I actually never really thought in depth about the ritual quality of the work. But even if I'm not very interested in ritual, also kind of outside of my work, when I understand that rituals help to formalize things in religion, in society at large, and for that they have a sense, like they make sense. To codify certain, I don't know, certain behavior, certain morale, and so on and so forth, but not for their own sake. I would think.
That makes sense. It also makes me think, earlier you had said something about the life cycle of these works and that having a relationship to cycles of change related to your own lived experience. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of looking at these two projects, the Basic Series and Camino Fantasma, together, is really the first time that I think I've seen the Basic Series in this context, simply because before I always thought of it as in kind of an architectonic context, in if not a site-specific, at least a site-responsive context, where some of these works are very much mirroring or have a spatial relationship to the architecture of their environment or the nature of their environment. And we see that again with the materiality and some of these being allowed to kind of return to nature. But I'm interested now in kind of where this fits into the larger context of land art, because I think so many of us, when we think about land art, we think of Robert Smithson in the desert, or we think maybe of in the contemporary sense, taxonomical artists like Mark Dion that are looking at excavation and remnants and almost a quasi-archaeological aspect. But where your work is kind of on this line between the architectonics of construction and this material use of the natural environment, branching out of kind of these urban settings or these public parks, these manicured green spaces into a more natural landscape. What has that done to change the series?
Well, like with many things, and every artist would probably maybe reluctantly agree, but would know exactly what I'm talking about. You discover things as you do work, right? So it wouldn't be true if I were to claim I started out 7 years ago with this series of works, kind of, that kind of has all these aspects to unpack, and I entirely kind of like preconceived, and since then I've been doing 54 iterations of that kind of like set piece of work or set concept. So no, you discover things. So when I started this series of work, it was really, like many things, they come out of desperation. or out of practical considerations, it was really a question of me. I wanted to, I mean, I'm trained as an architect. I've always been interested in public space within my architectural practice, and how to bring my sculptural practice or my sculptural interest into the public realm without living in New York, without having an enormous overhead, meaning large space, and as we all know, space is a premium in New York, and the technical outfit. So as I had to come up with a concept that allowed me to do sculptural work without the overhead that's actually typically required for large-scale work. That's really how this language out of 2x4s, which allows me really, I can fly to, I don't know, Orlando, Florida, which was just installed. I don't need a studio there. I can just fly there and screw together the material on site. It's very efficient that way. But once you do that, and once you do it twice, and the third time, and so on and so forth, and then it's kind of like demolished, the question does kind of like come up for oneself. Like, what does it actually mean? What does it mean? I mean, what does it mean to do a sculpture, right? Like something that that holds my interest, at least, to really assign like a 1-year life to it. And then you pretty quickly realize that actually, 2x4s were initially also chosen because it's a cheap way of doing things, right? But then usually when I do an installations, it's always in the contract. You have to clean up after, you have to take it off again. So the question comes, okay, what am I going to do with those 2x4s? And then it kind of very easily kind of like the recycle aspect comes into, it's perfectly usable after the installation as framing wood again. So suddenly this whole series of works has kind of like has gotten its own dynamic in terms of how you actually think of material, right? So the piece that we see here in Milwaukee, all of these pieces can be recycled 100%. There's no waste whatsoever, and it can be perfectly used for building a porch or some house extension, which has also actually in one early instance where that was really an installation where that was made very aware, where I was made very aware of that. It was in New York, in Rosendale, for the Women's Studio Workshop, which is a fabulous non-for-profit. They have a residency and so forth. So they had this summer outdoor sculpture for 4 months. And so that was, I think, my third installation in the series that I built there. And everybody loved it. The curator wanted to extend it. And so it kind of like, it could have easily stayed in existence for a year. However, the Women's Studio Workshop had paid for the material, and they were just expanding their print shop, and so the material was already budgeted in terms of, no, we need that. So this 3 months, then we need the material, which was painful for me at the time, but I actually really liked it afterwards. So that there is this notion of change, right? Which is really, it's really, we so easily think of our kind of like work, in particular if it's sculpture, quite frankly, we so easily think of our work as kind of like, okay, now it's done and it has, like now it's static. Now that I'm done, it has to be static. Like it's not, it shouldn't be changing now because it's finished, right? Which is really not how life works. So in that respect, I very much appreciate that aspect of it, and I've come to really embrace that aspect of it.
With that in mind, I want to go to a question that was submitted to our Q&A from fellow artist, Jason Pickelman. And Jason says, as an artist, do your feelings ever get hurt when you see people disrespecting your work, as so often happens with the case in public art? And if so, how have you learned to cope with the slight? And I assume this is in reference to some of the Instagram images you showed us where maybe the intended purpose was not to be used for children to climb on or to take wedding photos.
None of my pieces has ever been defaced. And I get that question almost with every installation, whatever the entity is, the public art program of city XYZ. It just is always the question, what do you do when somebody tags it, or and so on and so forth. It never happened in 54 installations. It never got kind of vandalized or something like that. However, I actually, and I might have different feelings with other work, but within that series of basics, as I really, I do embrace the fact that I give part of my artistic agency away the minute it's actually out there. So I do want to consider it as part of public space. And if somebody climbs on top of it, I have no problem. If somebody uses it as a jungle gym, I have no problem whatsoever with it. If somebody does yoga in it, I have no problem whatsoever with it. If somebody were to, I don't know, tear off some 2x4s and take them home because they need some framing wood, my feelings would be hurt. But so far, in all instances, I have not encountered an instance where somebody really disrespected the work. They might have misused it, but then what's misuse? It's public space. So I embrace if somebody kind of hangs out there. Actually, I like that. Jason, does that answer your question?
One of the things that I've always appreciated about working with you is I'll say the open-mindedness that you bring to all of your projects. And in some ways, I think it's that exact decision you've just articulated, the decision to interpret these gestures as and just an existing element of the work or something that the work begets, rather than to take it extremely personally, which is the case with very many artists. Not that I'm casting aspersions on Jason in that way at all. He's equally open-minded, I feel. I have another question here. Actually a remark from our curator, Michelle Grabner, and she says, I'm grateful for Matthias's work as I teach it to SAIC, School of the Art Institute of Chicago students, and shape it as a hard edge, rigorous drawing practice. Thank you, Michelle, for that. And I also have a question from Sarah Lechner. She has two questions, actually. First, she says, hi, Matthias, love your work. Is there a back and forth between you making the work in your studio and you experiencing the outdoor space it will be installed in? Does the public space aesthetically influence the work? That is her first question.
It's very different with different iterations. Like very often I don't really know. I mean, I always ask to get some documentation of the site and to get a sense of where it's installed and so on and so forth. But photos very often don't really give you a true sense of the site. And so I typically don't see the site. If it's somewhere in New York, or if it's close by. I'm doing an installation actually in at the end of May, beginning of June, in Massachusetts, and it's going to be a little bit of a larger installation, and I scouted out the site and so forth. So if I have the opportunity, I do want to take the site as much into consideration as possible. That said, very often I have a vague idea of the site. Is it an expanse? Is it a large lawn, or are there trees and so on and so forth? So I try to react to that, but I very often don't have a really close idea of the site. So, but I always go for the installation like I know exactly what I want to do. So it's not that I'm flying to whatever, Florida, to stay in that example, and go there and see, okay, well, I'm sure I come up with something once I'm there. That's so I know what I'm intending to do. But I'm actually going to quickly show that, because that was actually a very, for me also a very interesting experience. This piece here in Wake Forest, North Carolina, they had sent me photos. I kind of like thought I knew the site. It's like a little public park in Wake Forest. All the photos that they had shown kind of like showed this vast kind of piece of grass. Like it seemed like something that really wants to kind of like spread out. And that's what I had conceived of, and that's what I had planned to do. And once I got there, it was actually, there was a second level to the landscape. Like the park was actually really depressed, and the street was like up here, which none of the photos had shown. So there was really kind of like a second level of perspective to it, and it was really kind of like a vertical side rather than a horizontal side. So like this piece I completely changed on site. So it's the whole breadth of it, depending on the conditions.
I'm glad you showed this again. This is actually during the presentation. I had grabbed a screen capture of this because it's the first time I've seen this image, and it's so compelling to me. I think of your work, or this particular series of works, in that public space context, and this has like a strangely domestic proximity to what looks like a house or a similarly constructed building behind. And just the scale of the work to the tree. It's interesting to hear that this is an isolated instance where you did change your plans on site, because again, we talk about kind of site responsiveness. It's what you're playing with here in terms of scale and in terms of architecture, even in terms of the way that this kind of looks like a winding footpath, and knowing that you're at a different elevation than the primary space in the park. Did you have the choice of siting the work specifically here or siting it throughout the property? Was there something about this site that intrigued you more?
No, I had the choice. I had free reign here. But very often I find that, and it still surprises me, but I'm very happy about it. That very often in my applications, I usually put it in the application, like this is what I'm proposing, but it might also look different. And I have like most kind of like public art entities within that kind of format have given me really quite free reign. It's not the only installation that does, like this looks nothing like what I had proposed. With other installations, I had also made adjustments, like where things change, but it's never been a problem. Like there's a certain, of course it helps, the more installations you've done, the more trust there is also from the people. But I'm actually, to a certain degree, I'm amazed with how much reign I've been given with, like in some little town in Wake Forest, and they just say, okay, build something here. Yeah.
That's always the best case scenario. Yeah. Another question from Sarah is, in the basic series, is chronology important for the work? And I know actually that it come up kind of with the Milwaukee project. I believe that you had kind of numerically assigned a place in the series to projects that had been maybe delayed by the pandemic. And so even though they did not exist until after number 51 was built, they still held the chronology of 47 or 50, if I recall.
So the chronology is, to me, not important at all, quite frankly. And it's only, it happened a couple of times. Actually, it happens quite frequently over the last 7 years, that you send out an application, you are at number, whatever it is, like, you've done 23 of these installations, but you send out 3 applications and you put in the application, all 3 of them, basics number 24, and then 2 of them say yes, or they delay with saying yes. In the meantime, you have built another 2 already. So I've had that a couple of times where, like, where the number is really only assigned once it's actually built. The one exception is this installation, which was done for Arte Laguna in Venice. Because there it was really, like, the number 40 was assigned to it already. It was supposed to be installed in 2019, just when the pandemic hit. And then Arte Laguna was just postponed for almost 2 years. So it was kind of like in the show already, 2019, but it wasn't built. So I had to kind of like give number 40, just kind of like put that out of the chronology. But other than that, it's really just chronological. And yeah.
Do you see through chronology or any other element, even your relocation part-time to Athens, do you see an end cap or a particular kind of lifespan of this series? Is there a number you'll stop at, or is it just opportunity-based?
Well, I mean, I've had friends ask me, like, how many do you still want to do? Kind of like, right? So no, to me, it's kind of, it's really, and this, the installation in Italy is also really an outlier in that it's really hard to come by 2x4s in Italy, and not 2x4s that you see here. So to me, it's really an American project on so many levels. So I'm not, even though Camino Fantasma has a lot to do with it, and it's the same language, but it's not within that series. So to me, it's, as long as I still have formal challenges, like as long as I come still up with things that are interesting to me, like they never repeat. They always do something new that is interesting to me. As long as I still have kind of a new formal exploration, that's how long that might go on, as far as I'm concerned. And it hasn't come to its end yet. Like, it's quite amazing. Like the first installations were really, they were more or less cubes. Like this one was number 5. You know, like it was like playing around with the square form of 2x4 frame construction. And it's been for me really interesting to see how far you can actually push that language and still do new things within that. And that hasn't come quite to an end yet. So I don't have a cap on it. That said, I don't think that, I mean, I know that I have like 3 installations scheduled still for this year. It's ongoing still, but I'm quite sure that the work will change. It's not a project that is located in Greece.
Is there, since you had mentioned earlier that you don't always have even good documentation of the site, much less time to spend in the site and think about it in terms of influence, what is the generative point when you go into another one of these? Since you are so far into the series and it is something that is still speaking to you as ground to experiment, where do those ideas start?
I mean, over the past 7 years, I've done a lot of iterations, and I draw them up in the computer, usually. Like in the beginning, I built a lot of models as well, like three-dimensional models. By now, I'm too lazy to do that because it's much faster doing a computer. But so I have a big repository of of iterations that might be interesting. So it's not entirely static, but I have a few pieces or gestures. Let's call them gestures. Like they're not finished pieces in my mind, but I have a few gestures that are not fully explored yet. And then, yeah, if there's a new piece, I might just kind of like go ahead with one of these unexplored ideas. But so it typically, like I explore in the computer and then I see which iteration might be interesting for a specific to be realized in a specific context.
Well, we're thrilled to have a work in Milwaukee as part of Sculpture Milwaukee in 2021. And as we're nearing the end of the hour here, I just wanted to thank you again for participating in the exhibition, for coming out and doing the on-site build and involving members of our community in that, for allowing us to keep this on view for the extended exhibition run. And just in general, you are one of the artists that I had the pleasure of working with very, very early in my time in the art world when I was still a teenager. And it's been so exciting to see your practice develop and to see this whole series come to fruition. And such a pleasure to be able to bring one of those projects to Milwaukee. So thank you again, and thank you for the time today to walk us through this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Always.
Thanks again to Michelle and Theaster for the exhibition, which will remain on view until October of this year. June of 2022, so coming up shortly, we have our next exhibition opening, which will be Nature Doesn't Know About Us, guest curated by Ugo Rondinone. So there is a pleasant overlap between Michelle and Theaster's show and Ugo's show. So I encourage everybody to come up this summer, come up before the fall, and see both exhibitions for yourself. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And it was my pleasure.